Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story tells of a phantom thief, a hellborner. And this man was quite famous, and everyone was talking about him, because he had done many different things which people loved to gossip about. As his name suggests, the phantom thief sent out warning notices to all the people he was about to rob. He stole items of unknown value that were incredibly difficult to obtain, only to return them later without a trace. So the phantom thief was just playing pranks on the rich and spreading extravagant rumors about himself. People didn't understand how this was possible, but they couldn't do anything about it. Not only did he create themes that the public loved, but he was also in some ways even a righteous man who acted for society. And this eventually made him quite popular among all the citizens of the empire. They wanted to see him, and therefore quite often came to the scene of the crime, which he reported in advance. But in reality, even the famous ghost thief had a dark motive that was clearly visible. In fact, he was the main brain that worked against the protagonist and his allies in this whole story. It was Rutger Kassin, the young Viscount, and even the thief's actions were part of his plan to prevent the protagonist from achieving happiness. In fact, this story also tells about a girl who was reincarnated into this novel, where the phantom thief was the main mind of the story. Her name was Clara. She was the young captain of the Ruby Knights and also a melancholic civil servant. But in reality, the girl was simply also a playable citizen of the Empire and a character who is not even described in a single line of the original story of the novel. As before, Clara planned to avoid any connection with the main characters and the original story, regardless of them being the main characters, and live her life peacefully, as a civil servant until the end. That was exactly what she was going to do. That was her plan. She didn't want to attract attention and just wanted to live a quiet life. Or maybe she just thought so, but in fact, the reality turned out to be completely different. And she found herself in a completely unexpected place where she didn't even plan to be. Sometime after she was transported to Ravan, the girl made a huge mistake and ended up removing the phantom thief's mask with her own sword. The man was actually happy to be caught. He smiled and ran his hand through his hair, greeting Commander Clara and wondering if she had been waiting for the right opportunity to do this. He also said that she was quite polite and that this made him happy. But the girl immediately began to protest, saying that this was not true at all. It was just an unexpected incident, and she did not know at all that it was him. The man, still smiling, said that with such a fast sword, she was able to remove his mask without any special effort. That is why he replied that it is difficult for him to call such a case simply a surprise. Clara sighed heavily and tried to calm down. She was very worried. Then she swore that she was never going to reveal his identity, no matter what happened. She did not want to do that for anything. Of course, as soon as the Viscount heard this, he was incredibly surprised because he expected a completely different reaction, and not that she would swear allegiance to him. Clara at the same time approached the mask that was lying on the floor. She took it in her hands. After that, she handed the mask to the man and told him not to be embarrassed in any way, but to just take it and leave. Then their paths should never cross again. Of course, the Viscount was surprised. He just looked at her for a while, and then asked in a cold voice if she had decided to make fun of him now, since he was the one who had lost. Clara was all on edge. She immediately said that of course it wasn't so. In fact, she really had no intention of revealing his true identity. She wanted, as much as he did, for the man to remain anonymous. The girl continued to swear by everything she could that she would never tell a single living soul who he was. She also replied that she had no proof, strictly speaking. Therefore, the girl replied that even if she started talking about Viscount Kassin being the phantom thief Heilbronner, people would simply think that she had gone crazy, because she really did not have a single piece of solid evidence against him. For a while, the man just stood there and looked at her with a surprised look, but then he began to slowly walk closer to Clara. His appearance alone had already scared the girl very much, but when he spoke, she was simply shaking with fear. The man said that because of her words, rumors could spread to some extent, but Clara kept assuring him that she wouldn't tell a soul anything. She swore by heaven, Buddha, Jesus, or Allah. She didn't care who he believed in. She could swear to anyone that she wouldn't tell anyone. When silence fell between them again, she looked at the man with a hopeful gaze and asked him what he thought about it. Cassin just stood there and looked at her. In fact, Clara couldn't take her eyes off him because she couldn't understand if it was really an angel sent to her from heaven standing right in front of her. Then suddenly the guy started to move closer to her, and now they were a few centimeters apart. He quietly asked if she was really going to let him go like that. Clara was a little surprised by these words, but she swore again that she would not tell anyone, continuing to hold his face mask in her hands. The girl began to speak very quickly because she was nervous. She replied that from the very beginning, if she wanted to catch him, she had more than 10 opportunities to do so, so she did not consider it necessary to doubt her fidelity now. Without thinking twice, the Viscount snatched the mask from her. With a heavy sigh, he turned and began to leave without saying a single word to her. The man put the mask back on his head and said that since she was so confident that she would not blab, he would still believe her words. At that moment, the boy waved his cloak and began to evaporate into thin air, saying that he wanted to see how strong this faith would be. Once it evaporated, Clara was finally able to exhale all the weight that had accumulated in her soul. She was very glad that he left and doubted that she had managed to somehow save herself, but still hoped for the best. Of course, the girl never wants to contact him again without a reason and does not want her peaceful life as a civil servant to be disturbed. That's why she made such a choice, because it was even beneficial for her. But then the girl suddenly became wary. She thought that all this was more like the prologue of a romantic fantasy in which the main woman deeply interacts with the main brain of this story. And as soon as Clara realized this, she understood that she had found herself in this very sinister novel. At the moment when misfortunes began to fall upon the life of the girl who was dedicated to being a temporary citizen of the Empire, all this happened a month ago. One evening, before all this happened, she was sitting in her office and turned to her assistant, saying that she was safe. Clara pointed to her watch and said that it was almost daytime, and asked if he had forgotten that he had promised to treat her to dinner if she returned before the end of the lunch break. The guy smiled and started to straighten his hair back and said that the new gloves from the boutique were no longer available. And this, of course, was very sad for her. This man was Leon, and he was the secretary of the Ruby Knights. Of course, Clara knew he was lying. He was just sad because he couldn't get in touch with her. The girl also considered him a real sadist because he really loves to watch other people suffer. In fact, the Ruby Knights that she led as a commander was an organization name that might seem rather pretentious and completely inappropriate. However, this was not the case at all. It was simply a group of failed knights who heard complaints and appeals. On this day, when she was happy that she was able to choose the argument, the girl had to leave lunch halfway to stop a drunk who had caused himself a lot of trouble. After that, Clara made a bet with Leon. As soon as she was shouting joyfully, the guy sighed heavily and said that he had lost, and that evening he would treat everyone to a drink at their usual pub, which they often go to. The girl was immediately happy about this, but then suddenly Billy, who was Ruby's sword, appeared behind them. The man asked if he really wanted to kill them, since the guy would have preferred a restaurant rather than a pub where you can only drink. Leon smiled tensely at this point and turned to Billy, saying that the mayor had sent an official letter that was addressed to their knights and wondered if Billy could bring it. As soon as the man heard about this, he was immediately happy because he really loved to be useful. So, running to the exit, he said that he would do it immediately. As soon as he ran out the door, Leon sighed heavily and said that he really was just that funny. That's why they tried to be friendly with him, so as not to hurt his tender feelings. Clara, meanwhile, began to take off the extra things on her uniform and asked him to calm down a little, because he just likes to watch people suffer, and that is why he always makes fun of him. In the last moment of silence, she suddenly remembered that she wanted to talk to him about something and asked what was known about Sursane. Was there any answer from him? Leon replied that unfortunately there had been no word from him and asked if she had ever personally seen Sursane correctly distinguish when he was inactive. The guy also said that this chaotic mess is the true strength of their knights, so he believes there is no need to change anything. Clara laughed nervously and said that if he really thought that was strength, then what about the newbie who did everything with all his heart? Or the slacker? Or the professional veteran who couldn't even properly sign in at the start of his shift? And of course, on top of all this chaos was a 24-year-old young captain. So with a sigh, she accepted the reality and said that their knights really were incapable of anything. Leon chuckled and smiled and asked if it was true that they had a competent and very handsome clerk. The girl agreed with him, saying that there were also former elites who were demoted after attracting the attention of the wrong person. So indeed, they had a perfect balance in the company, so she saw no point in changing anything. When Clara said these words, she sat back down in the chair and thought that, in fact, she really liked all of this. Being the captain of a knightly order hidden in the very corner of society was a pleasure for her, and she never intended to get involved with the main character of the novel. And besides, the story was not supposed to lead him to her, so the girl was calm. She thought that everything would be calm, just like always. But then suddenly, one of the lower knights ran into the room, turned to the captain, and said that he brought an official letter, as he was asked. The girl immediately smiled and thanked him for it. Of course, she was very irritated by the noise the guy was making, but she smiled tensely and said that she was very glad that he did his job quickly and well. Taking the letter from him, Clara said that she would just look at what was written there. But as soon as she began to read it, her hands immediately began to shake with horror. The girl's voice suddenly began to tremble. She turned to Leon, handed him a piece of paper and asked him to read it, and asked, "Is it really not her imagination?" The girl was in real despair. She asked the man to read her this official letter again, so that she could verify its truthfulness. Of course, Leon was a little surprised by her reaction. Then he opened the piece of paper and began to read its contents. It was written there that the tasks that were previously carried out by the security department regarding the Phantom Thief case were being transferred to the Ruby Knights. As soon as Clara heard this, she was simply horrified, just like Leon, because he did not expect to hear this, and she understood that all this was very bad. The girl did not understand why everything happened exactly this way, because it was obvious that no one could catch up with this Phantom Thief. So it was a mystery to her how they could trust this most important matter to their department at all. She was also terrified that she would now have to work closely with the main antagonist of the novel. In fact, this character, as well as Clara herself, were heroes from a novel that she read in her past life. The girl loved the story very much, and the Phantom Thief was the second male protagonist and a secretive antagonist who was quite bad. The girl herself became a servant of the baby prince, or a little evil for short-term use. In fact, it was a reverse harem novel that told about various events. There was also a prince in this story, whom the girl had taken care of since she was a child. But as soon as he grew up, he became obsessed with his maid, who was also the main character of the novel. That was the gist of the story. However, Clara had also realized that the world had only become obsessed with this little guy in the past year. And this is exactly when rumors began to spread about the exploits of the Phantom Thief. Of course, on the very first day, walking through the streets and living her quiet life, when Clara saw an advertisement about the Phantom Thief, she was simply incredibly shocked. As soon as she recognized one familiar name, she immediately remembered what story she was in, and what scared the girl most was the fact that she was not just reborn, but found herself inside a novel. The story of the Phantom Thief captivated people so much that even some children wanted to become like him, despite the fact that the man pursued rather dubious ideas. In fact, this same Phantom Thief began to gain popularity, and this meant that the girl found herself approximately in the middle of the story, where the prince had already become an adult. In fact, the male protagonist, the once wronged second prince, began to shine, and Ruger Casting, who was an ally of the first prince's faction, secretly sabotaged him as the Phantom Thief. However, when the girl learned all this information, she realized that something did not add up. Working in her organization, she approached Leon and asked why the Phantom Thief case was being handled by their Ruby Knights, who were incapable of anything. Of course, it was no secret to anyone that their organization was the last place they could turn to. The man took this news quite calmly and told the commander that perhaps this was done in order to try to carry out this mission before giving it to a more prestigious order. Leon also said that this was done so that they would avoid embarrassment later if they screwed up. He believed that they would let the Ruby Squad fail first and then take the experience and information they gathered during that time. The girl continued to hold the sheet of paper with trembling hands. Agreeing with her assistant, she said that it really did have its meaning. In fact, in the original story of this novel, once the Phantom Thief gained fame, the Diamond Knights immediately began to deal with him. They were the elite of all the elite knights there could be, the royal family's direct task force. They only took on the most high-profile cases. So now that the girl had been handed this task, she was very surprised. Clara sat over the piece of paper for some time and did not understand why these events began to differ from the original. After rereading the letter one last time, she realized that she should consult Sir Gaylock at this point to find out what was going on and what her next steps should be. So the next morning, Clara went to the Imperial Palace. In fact, the Diamond Knights were a direct knightly order of the royal family and the highest-ranking branch. If this were a normal case, the girl would have no need to come to this place. But since they only handle high-ranking and prestigious missions, she simply had to go there. Clara stood at the front door and realized that it felt like an eternity had passed since she had last visited this place, so she was a little worried. But soon she finally plucked up her courage and knocked. A voice came from there asking who had come. Clara replied that it was she, the captain of the Ruby Knights. As soon as Commander Gaylock heard this, he immediately became happy and asked the girl to wait for a while before entering. He explained that he already had an appointment with a guest, so he would like her to wait a little. Clara, of course, was very surprised that he already had someone come first. But soon this meeting ended, and the man allowed her to enter. At his desk sat Gaylock Schleifer, commander of the Diamond Knights and the supreme commander of all knightly orders. Seeing Clara, he greeted her and said that he was incredibly happy to finally meet her because a lot of time had passed since she last visited him. He also asked if the last time they really met was when she was appointed captain. The girl bowed and said that it was indeed so, and also asked for forgiveness for not visiting him earlier. But the man tried to calm her down, saying that she shouldn't apologize at all, because being a captain is a very busy business, and he is absolutely sure of it. Therefore, he understands perfectly well why she did not have the opportunity to visit him. Clara merely shook her head at this. In fact, her apologies were false, because when Sir Gaylock taught her fencing, she could not even describe how many circles of hell she had to go through under this man's guidance. The girl even now thought about the fact that perhaps she was that same cheerful student whom it was simply pleasant to mock, because he could not answer anything in return and simply endured all this. In fact, when the girl graduated from the academy, the man said that her swordsmanship would become rusty if she did not practice. So he asked her to visit him whenever she had time. He was going to personally supervise her training. Of course, that never happened. But now that she looks at him, she realizes that the man had incredibly good fencing skills. She was also impressed by the fact that he had risen on his own from the most humble lower knight to the title of count. Of course, this made her respect this man. But be that as it may, she was still a little afraid of him after her student years. After a long silence, Clara turned to him and said that she wanted to talk about the notice that their order had been assigned the Phantom Thief case. The man, upon hearing this, immediately said that the materials that were sent by the patrol department were collected by one of his knights, so she could go to the training ground to pick them up and make her job easier. The girl bowed and said that she understood everything perfectly, but before she could say anything else, the man raised his hand and wished her luck, saying that she could handle everything. Clara couldn't believe that he just shifted this work onto her and that's it, without even any compelling evidence or explanations as to why he did it. Before leaving, she awkwardly turned to the man and said that this matter seemed to her to be really too big for their small order, so she believed that it would simply be beyond their capabilities. Clara also added that, with this in mind, she would like to receive more funding or manpower, since there is no way she can refuse this task. The girl told the commander that, as he himself knew, the number of Ruby Knights had significantly decreased, so there were absolutely not enough of them to deal with such an important and responsible matter. As soon as the man heard her words, he immediately thought about it and said that he had not taken this into account at all, so he sees his mistake. Of course, the girl was outraged by his reaction, because he should have thought about it from the very beginning. But she did not tell him this. Meanwhile, the man smiled and said that he would definitely think about it. Of course, Clara knew perfectly well that by saying that, he meant that her file wasn't even worth looking at, so he wasn't going to waste his time on all that. As soon as he saw her indignant expression, he said that if it was really a big task for them, then he could hand it over to the Emerald Knights. The girl thought that they would certainly not accept this matter, and therefore it would automatically go back to their order. Therefore, there was no point in even trying. She felt that the best way, instead of handing the matter back to them, would be to simply accept it gracefully and even thank them for it. She figured that maybe if they were nice, they could get a little extra funding or manpower. So she approached Sir Gaylock and said that since he had commissioned them, they would of course see it through. Of course, she knew that it was rather dirty and shameless to do so, but at least she was scoring points in her favor. So she began to flatter him, saying that she always knew that the phantom thief, who was disturbing the peace of their citizens, would be quite a challenge for her. That is why the girl stated that she would gladly take on this matter with her order in order to finally defeat this thief and bring peace back to their streets. Clara promised the commander that she would definitely put this idiot on a leash and show him how strict the laws of the Empire are. The man, who was the phantom thief, was sitting in the next room at that moment and heard her conversation perfectly well. That's why he became very interested in the girl. The commander, hearing her mood, said that it seemed to him that he had really found the most suitable person for this responsible and important job. Smiling, the man also added that he was sure the bosses would be delighted, especially when they were able to catch the thief. But then he suddenly stood up from his seat and said that since she was so motivated, it was the perfect time, which meant that she should meet his guest, who just happened to have arrived before she did. The commander explained that if she was working on a thief's case, she would see that person often in the future, so he thought it was better to get to know her earlier. As soon as Clara heard about a guest, she was very surprised. The man at that moment explained that the guest was waiting for her in a special room next door, so he asked the girl to follow him. As soon as he opened the door to the room, he asked that they finally get to know each other. Clara was incredibly surprised at that moment. She froze in place and looked at the man who, having heard that they were coming towards him, had already approached the door. After a moment of silence, the commander said that this was the young Duke Rutger Cassin. The man was truly stunning. His blonde hair matched his outfit perfectly, and his emerald eyes were so beautiful that it was impossible to look away. Clara at that moment was ready to simply scream in horror as soon as she saw this man, because she immediately recognized him. Then suddenly, she remembered the words she had spoken about the phantom thief, and she immediately felt uneasy, because she understood that he had heard them. The girl stood completely silent and looked at the man without taking her eyes off him. She could not understand what the phantom thief was doing in this place at all. Of course, it was not clear from his reaction whether he heard or understood the girl's words, but she was still very worried that this could affect her future work and perhaps even her life. After an awkward silence, the commander turned to them and said that, of course, their young duke was quite an interesting man. However, he told the girl that she could not just stand there and stare at him without even introducing herself. Clara, hearing this phrase, immediately felt embarrassed because she did not look at him at all because she liked him. So she immediately bowed and said that she was very glad to meet him. After that, she introduced herself and said that she was the captain of the Ruby Squad. The girl looked at him and understood that meeting with the shadowy main man who appeared out of nowhere could affect her peaceful life. But what scared the girl most was the fact that he looked simply stunningly good. She thought that he would not be so handsome and stunning. Clara thought it was really quite obvious. After all, he had to be handsome to qualify for the second male lead. Even though he was a villain, he had the right to look good. At that moment, the Viscount extended his hand forward and said that he, too, was very pleased to meet her. Then he gave her a more informal name. His name was Rutger Cassin. The man explained that she could call him that. Clara shook his hand in response and said that she looked forward to their work together, as she considered it a great honor for herself. The captain then turned to the girl, saying that Lord Cassin worked in the Imperial Palace and was also in charge of the ruins of the Empire and the cultural aspect. Of course, Clara knew all of this very well, because she had read the description of this hero in the original story, so these facts had long been known to her. The man said that recently there had been information that the phantom thief was targeting some of these ruins, so he believed that the girl would be working closely with the Duke. Clara sighed heavily, thinking that managing the ruins that would later be captured by him was quite funny for her. But she managed to contain her emotions. The girl bowed again and said that, of course, from now on she would see him more often, and this could not but please her. The man was silent for a while and then said that it seemed to him that the girl and her order harbored a great grudge against this very thief. Clara, hearing these words, immediately realized that he had heard her loud scream when she swore to her commander that they would definitely show where this thief's place was, and all that sort of thing. The man suddenly started smiling and asked her if she had any specific reason to hate this man. The girl didn't know what she should do or respond to in such a situation because she couldn't tell him the truth. It was also a little surprising to her that a man of his status could even be offended by the fact that she suddenly began to criticize him. But she considered that this was rather petty even for a villain. Clara understood that in a situation like this she had to get out of it, so she replied that she didn't hold any particular grudge against this man. However, this phantom thief is one who disregards the laws that were established by the great Emperor Hexen III. And she, as a knight of course, cannot know and respect such a person. So it is completely incomprehensible to her how she can calmly treat this thief who simply touches her soul. The girl decided that it was time to answer with the same phrase as in the book. She had to make sure that he would not suspect any ulterior motives in her. These were the usual basic skills of a knight, so she did not even have to work hard. The man smiled and said that she looked like a capable person, so he was confident that she would achieve results that reflected her chivalry and would be able to catch this thief. Clara agreed with him, but she herself did not understand why he did not simply curse her for achieving such results in her life. The girl also knew that she needed to get out of this place as soon as possible if she valued her life. So without thinking twice, she bowed again and said that they could continue their conversation, which they had been having from the very beginning, and that it was time for her to go. The commander, of course, was a little surprised by her quick departure, but the girl replied that she was in this place during her working hours, so she needed to go back. But then suddenly the Viscount, smiling, said that this was very good, and also added that they would see each other next time, and he would look forward to this meeting with impatience. Clara practically ran to the exit and said that, of course, she was also looking forward to seeing him again. But in reality, she didn't want to see him ever again. The girl just not remained choice. As soon as all this commotion was over, and the chief knight closed the door behind Clara, the Viscount suddenly turned to him and asked, "Isn't this girl too young to be the captain of the Ruby Knights?" The older man laughed and said that this was indeed true, but there was a whole story behind it. Of course, the Viscount wanted to hear her, and the man then explained that she had once been part of the same knightly order as the son of a high-ranking nobleman from the imperial palace. However, Lady Clara outshone this man with her skill, which meant that she was taken, saying that a girl, a simple knight, a commoner, dared to become higher than the son of a nobleman, so, of course, no one accepted her. They couldn't fire her right away because it would look really bad on their part. So they gave her a nominal captaincy in a minor knightly order so that people wouldn't ask any questions. As soon as the Viscount heard this story, he immediately thought about it and said that it was rather sad that she had been treated like that, because according to his stories, she was indeed a capable girl. The captain agreed with him and said that he still felt sympathy for her, since he himself came from simple knights. Therefore, he was very sad that such an injustice happened to her. But as a newly formed nobleman without a faction, it is difficult for him to openly support her position, so he has to hide it. Casson, finishing his tea, said that this was probably true, and also asked what was going on about this Sir Jalak. The man asked, did he really hope that she would be able to capture this phantom thief? He believed that this was probably why the man had entrusted her with this case, so that she could earn a new title by achieving success in this mysterious investigation. Without a shadow of doubt or dissatisfaction, the captain said that this was indeed so, because she was a real genius who could cope with this story. The man also said that despite all this, Lady Clara tends to underestimate herself, and given what he had already told the man about her history, she would most likely act very carefully so as not to anger her superiors. The Viscount at that moment shook his head and said that he understood perfectly well what he meant, because from that moment on, he too would be watching her to see what she was capable of. Clara, meanwhile, walked very quickly along the corridors to get away from this place as quickly as possible because she was uncomfortable there. She kept thinking about what had happened, and also realized that she would eventually be the one to handle the Phantom Thief case. She also understood that she was now under fire and on the bad side, so she would not be able to live her life peacefully. Of course, Clara was very annoyed by the fact that all the misfortunes continued to accumulate, so she decided to just go and get the case materials from the training ground and then go back so as not to think about it anymore. Soon the girl came there and suddenly noticed that she had ended up on a training ground. In that place, in fact, some knights were being trained. Then suddenly she saw one girl and thought that this was most likely the knight who was responsible for the matter that her boss had mentioned. But when Clara took a closer look, she realized that she really was just a delightful and incredibly beautiful girl. At that moment, this stranger approached her, and asking for forgiveness asked, was she really a servant of the imperial palace? The woman also said that only authorized persons were allowed into the training area, so she needed to ask the girl to leave the area. Of course, Clara was very shocked by all this. She could not believe that the woman actually mistook her for a servant because of the poor condition of her clothes. It even hurt her. But in a calm voice, she explained that her lack of a knight's cloak had caused a misunderstanding. Then she introduced herself, saying that she was the captain of the Knights of the Rubies. And as soon as the young lady heard this information, she even jumped up in surprise. She immediately began to bow and ask forgiveness for this terrible mistake. The woman also said that she was truly incredibly sorry that she couldn't figure it out right away, but Clara waved her hand and said that it was okay because her clothes had deceived her. Then the girl who made the mistake said with tears in her eyes that her name was Ren Maple, and she is one of the Diamond Knights. As soon as Clara heard about this, she was incredibly shocked. She certainly did not expect to see Ren in this place and meet her in person. Of course, the secondary heroine in the original story was this girl. She was the one who often guarded the main man, making the main heroine unconsciously jealous. Ren herself, of course, did not have any feelings for the main character, although she was the most simple knight, but quite good at performing her duties. The girl continued to ask Clara for forgiveness, saying that she was really ashamed of the mistake that had happened. But Clara tried to calm her down, saying that it was completely normal and there was nothing wrong with it. Of course, Clara thought her behavior was quite sweet, but at that moment a man suddenly came out to them and addressed her in a very stern voice. The stranger placed Ren behind him and, speaking to Clara, said that judging by her appearance, she was probably a palace employee, and asked why, in that case, she dared to disturb their gorgeous knight. As soon as Ren saw her Captain Cross Narata, she was very surprised. She immediately responded that he should not do that, because this person is not who he thought. But the man, turning to the girl, suddenly began to shout and told her to step aside, because he could calmly deal with all this. Ren continued to beg him and ask him to calm down, because this could end badly, but the man did not listen to her. Clara at that moment thought that this was precisely the same selfish captain who was puffing out his chest with pride. She even felt sorry for this knight. But the girl at that moment took out her ID and said that it was a misunderstanding. She asked him to look at the badge and also introduced herself, saying that she was the captain of the Ruby Knights. As soon as the man heard this, he became even more angry, and his reaction was completely different from Ren's. He asked, "Really, she really is Captain These Waste?" This commander began to laugh loudly and asked how she dared to join another knightly order and behave so arrogantly and powerfully while insulting his subordinate. Ren immediately went to the captain and said that it was too disrespectful to treat a girl like that. But he continued to laugh and asked, did she really think so? Clara was shocked at that moment and did not understand why everyone around her was trying to create problems for her, but she just wanted to live peacefully and calmly. But despite her position of living without scandals, the girl could not tolerate the insult of the Knights of Reuben and considered that it crossed all boundaries. So she was going to stand up for herself and her order. The girl, frowning, addressed the man in a very rude voice and asked if she understood correctly that insulting her knightly order in her presence meant that he was prepared to face the consequences for these actions. As soon as the man heard this, he immediately became wary, started shouting again, and asked where she got this from. But Clara was now also on edge. She wondered if he was really challenging her to a duel, since she wasn't going to just tolerate insults directed at herself and her subordinates. At that moment, the girl took out her sword and thought that this was the perfect time to throw down the gauntlet in a dramatic manner. But she didn't do so, because they were in a different century. Before they could say another word, their argument was suddenly interrupted by the Viscount, who came to them and asked what was going on, what all the fuss was about. As soon as Clara looked at him and saw the man, she was very surprised. She did not understand why he came all the way here, because she thought that he had already gone back to his palace a long time ago. Then the captain suddenly turned to the Viscount and said that there was no need for concern at all, since this so-called captain of the Ruby Knights had just been insulted for her insolence towards one of their members. Of course, when the girl heard this, she couldn't believe that he was actually saying these words. She was ready to strangle him on the spot, but she didn't do it. The Viscount suddenly turned to Clara and asked in an alarmed voice if this was really true. The girl, taking advantage of the wonderful opportunity, said that this was not at all the case. The insult had actually come from this man, and that was why she had challenged Sir Crossnern to a duel to settle everything properly. The man, who had not been listening to her at all at that moment, now realized that she had indeed challenged him to a duel, and was therefore very surprised. After all, saying such words right in front of the Viscount meant that there would be no retreat. Ren herself was very surprised. In fact, in a knightly duel, being wounded or even dying is not punishable by the law of the Empire, which means that in this way the duelist is betting on his life. The captain immediately ran up to the Viscount and in a trembling voice asked how he could allow a duel over such a trifle, and asked that the man simply stop all this nonsense, and that they, like adults, would resolve this disagreement. However, Castan replied that duel between knights was their inalienable right, and therefore it was not something he should interfere with. He turned to Clara and said that she could act as she wanted because it was her personal right. Of course, the man thought that this would be a good chance to see the skills that the commander had praised so highly, so he happily approved of this bet. Clara was starting to feel very awkward at this point. She said that she had left her gloves in the knight's office and needed to get them before she could formally challenge this man. As soon as all these people heard this, they were incredibly surprised and even looked at her with a condemning look. Because of this, Clara felt very uneasy and terrible. After a short silence, the Viscount suddenly smiled and said that in that case, since they didn't have much time, she could use his glove. The man immediately took off his gloves and threw them to the girl, saying that she would have to throw his thing instead. However, he believes that all equals this maybe be counted. Clara still couldn't believe that he had actually done it, and now she had to throw down the gloves of the Viscount himself. And besides, these were not just ordinary gloves, but high-quality gloves from the most famous boutique in the Empire. And besides everything else, these gloves alone looked several times more expensive than her salary. So the girl was very surprised and did not understand how she could even accept this. But the Viscount suddenly began to turn around and leave, saying that he would simply watch this spectacle from the stands so as not to disturb them. Clara thought that she just needed to not take it to heart and just do what she had planned. So young woman abandoned glove in this trainer's. She screamed loudly and said that she was calling for blood to duel in the name of the Ruby Knights and their pride and honor. The girl also said that if she won, he would apologize for all the rude things he had said. By that time, the news had already spread in some places, and several people had gathered at the podium. Judge, who was supposed to monitor the rules of the duel, said that by mutual agreement duel will to begin. At this moment, the Viscount sat quietly in his place and heard the conversation of the other knights who were there. They, of course, did not consider Clara a worthy opponent and thought that the trainer would easily be able to defeat her in a very short time. Then the judge read out the terms of defeat. It was a declaration of surrender, the loss of weapons, or if Clara feared for her life, she could kneel and retreat right now. Then nobody not will suffer, and they will disperse peacefully. The man also said that when she reached a state where she could no longer continue the battle, she could also surrender, but the conditions would remain the same. Clara immediately laughed and said that he could still back down and apologize if he valued his life. But of course no one did. Then the judge flipped a coin and said the duel could begin. The girl, hearing these words, immediately ran to attack, grabbing her sword just like the man. Clara was in a very joyful mood because she was absolutely confident in her abilities. So when the trainer began to approach her, she was able to push off the ground and jump over him, landing on the other side. As soon as the coach saw this, he was very surprised. But before he could come to his senses, Clara went on the attack again and hit him on the back with all her might, so that even fire formed around him. Of course, the man did not expect such an approaching action from her, and immediately turned to deliver his own counterattack. Clara, as soon as she saw his heated gaze, realized that as a member of the Diamond Knights, he was quite skilled in using aura. Therefore, she quickly began to run away from there before he had time to hit her, because this weapon could be quite powerful. In fact, aura is a special power that is similar to Kai. It is different from magic, and it is something that a person is born with. By using aura, one can release a power that transforms human limits. This means that the most important ability of a knight is his aura. Every knight in the Empire had this magical ability, so the man was no exception. Clara had angered him, which meant he was going to use his aura too, but only in larger quantities. The trainer turned to her and shouted loudly, telling her that she could finish this in a moment. But it was too late, and he began to swing his sword, which was practically burning with flames. As soon as this flame started flying towards Lara, she reacted to it calmly. The girl simply raised her hand and was able to block this blow with an absolutely calm expression on her face. As soon as the people in the stands saw this, they were incredibly shocked. They thought that this flame was going to hit her, but she was able to get rid of it with such ease, turning its impact into fireworks. The man was actually incredibly surprised when she turned his powerful fire dragon into some fireworks, and that's why he got angry. The man even blushed from his anger and, in a trembling voice, asked how she dared to reject his abilities. But Clara continued to look at him with a surprised look, and asked if he really thought that if lightning were flying at him, he would just stand there and ignore it. She herself thought that the commander of the elite knightly order was using such an obvious trick. She was even a little disappointed in him because she thought that he would be a more professional person. Without thinking twice, the man immediately ran at her and called her a rat. Clara stood there, not understanding how his skill level could be so low. Of course, the girl was disappointed by all this because she didn't know that she would have to fight with a newcomer. She also thought that she didn't have much time for overtime work, so she was going to finish it immediately and go about her business. Clara used her aura to activate her sword's ability, and as soon as the man ran towards her, their weapons touched. He had to exert a lot of effort to keep her from hurting him. The girl herself was absolutely calm at that moment. When she got tired of this useless confrontation, she smiled, wished him luck, and said goodbye. At that very moment, she touched him with her sword and the man burst into flames. However, this fire lasted for some time and soon went out on its own. He fell to the ground, completely exhausted. The weapon also fell from his hands, and Clara only stood silently and looked at her defeated opponent. At that moment, the judge came out onto the battlefield and said that Clara had won the duel. But the stands were not so happy. After all, they, of course, expected her to lose and have terrible results. As soon as it was over, Ren immediately ran up to the girl and said that she was really impressed. She also asked her to take some water because she was probably tired after using so much aura. Clara immediately took the bottle of water and thanked her. And she herself wondered where the Viscount was sitting and what his reaction was to everything that had happened. When she looked to the side, she saw that he was no longer there, and this surprised the girl very much because she thought that he would stay until the end and would still want to talk to her about something. But the man, meanwhile, walked along the corridors and thought about what he had seen during the duel. The guy concluded that their chase would be much more interesting than he expected. Of course, he imagined this girl as completely incompetent, but in the end, she turned out to be a professional, and now he was interested in how she would catch the phantom thief. When the commander of all the knights said that he had absolute confidence in her, and that she would definitely be able to catch the thief, the man doubted it. However, now this was not empty bragging. As a knight, she said she couldn't recognize this thief, so he was going to watch her catch him. The man was also very interested to see her reaction if she suddenly caught him and found out who he really was. In the evening, when Clara finally returned back to her order, her assistant suddenly began to shout at the girl and said that he heard that she had found herself in trouble again. The girl who was sitting at dinner ignored these words, and Leon turned to her and asked if she was really delighted when, after a long time of rest, she was finally able to fight, and even win. Clara told the guy that it wasn't really like that. It was just a small skirmish. She knocked him out, so she couldn't even hear the apology she was asking for. Of course, her assistants were simply delighted. But it was quite reasonable to expect that the commander would really be amazing and would be able to cope with any task. After some time of silence, Leon approached her and said that, speaking of duels, he had heard that the young Duke Cassin was also present there, and said that the girl had somehow closed her eyes to it. Clara, when she remembered this, sighed heavily and said that it was indeed so. Since a duel was a knight's right, once the young Duke Cassin asked her about it, she had little choice. So instead of rejecting her idea, he even gave her his glove. She actually took out the thing and showed it to everyone else, saying that in the end she couldn't get the gloves back because he left so quickly that she didn't even notice when it happened. As soon as her deputy heard about this, he immediately slammed his hands on the table and asked if these were the very same limited edition gloves from the famous boutique. Clara was a little surprised by his reaction and wondered if they really were a limited edition. After all, she knew that they rare, but to so much so. The man beamed with joy and said that it was indeed so. They were made by the master craftsman himself. The legendary item is so rare that she cannot even confirm its existence because no one knew about this issue. Clara, as soon as she heard about this, was indignant and asked if they were really that incredible. But then she suddenly said that she didn't care about them at all, so she wouldn't even look at them again. Continuing to eat her food, she sighed and said that she would definitely return them to the man at the first meeting. The girl also said that the ruins that often become the ghost's target are under the jurisdiction of the young duke. So in any case, we will have to meet again, and more than once. As soon as Leon heard about this, he immediately sighed, thinking about this phantom thief, and said that it was because of this hooligan that their workload would definitely double, or even more. Of course, the guy was not used to such a large amount of work. He liked to relax and do nothing, so he was not at all happy about this prospect. But Clara, raising a bottle of alcohol, told him to drink it and just forget about it all, because the notification would not come to her in at least a few weeks anyway. So, what to this they have time? There is rest. Another knight said that they really didn't have to worry. After all, they could secretly raise this night without any worries, and then they all drank to the fragile and long-term survival of the Ruby Knights. In fact, even then, Clara didn't know how much worse things were than she thought. She couldn't even imagine how crazy this phantom thief could be. The next morning she came to another building and, seeing Sir Sane, was very surprised because he usually did not come to his office so early. The man looked very tired. This guy was one of the knights of their team, and when he saw the commander, he greeted her, wishing her a good morning. The guy also said that he had been working on the recording since the morning and had left it on the girl's desk. Instead, he asked if it would be okay if he went home around lunchtime, since he had done all the work pretty quickly, so that she could do it. Clara, of course, did not expect such success from him, but she said that everything was fine and he could leave. In fact, this guy was someone with a flexible work schedule. He liked to get everything done in one night and then go home earlier than everyone else. But before he left, the man said he wanted to know if it was true that the thief case fell under their jurisdiction, because he didn't know for sure. Clara immediately remembered that he was not there when she read the letter, and said that unfortunately this was indeed the case, and she herself, studying the papers, noticed that he had dealt with them well. The commander also explained that, as he himself knows, this phantom thief usually appears at night, and even if she wanted to leave it in the open, there was one thing she couldn't take into account. They didn't have enough manpower. Of course, this man was simply an evil thief who was ruining their work-life balance, because now their entire team would have a hard time due to the change in regime. After the guy and the girl had sorted out all their affairs, he was about to leave, but suddenly the door to their room opened. A joyful knight ran in. He turned to the commander and said that they had a big problem. Then the guy pointed to the piece of paper he was holding in his hands and said that the phantom knight had left them this notification card. As soon as Clara heard about it, she couldn't believe that it was really happening. She also thought that it was quite early, since so little time had passed since the last attack. Then the girl very quickly gathered her entire team to decipher this code. It was written there that at 10 o'clock in the evening he would steal Count Schulerman's secret thing. At this point, one of the knights, in order to defuse the situation, said that this was not the original note at all, but a copy. Therefore, in the event they cannot worry. Of course, everyone ignored his words. Leon turned to the commander and asked if it would really happen that day. According to previous cases, there were still 2 weeks left before this man would start to show activity. So it remained a mystery to him why he posted this note on the same day he was going to attack. Clara didn't answer. She just stood there silently, thinking that this was a clear test of wickedness, so she wasn't too worried. Of course, the girl knew that this would be a special advance warning. Immediately after the Order of Ruby accepted the case, it was written in all the newspapers, so she was not at all surprised that he did this. Clara understood that he had to show some activity so that people would not forget about him and begin to fear him even more, especially if the girl could not decipher all this and somehow counteract. The girl also thought that even yesterday, while talking to her, he was already thinking about returning home and preparing this announcement, as well as the attack. Of course, these were only her guesses, but for some reason she was absolutely sure of her assumptions. Of course, this all irritated her, because even magical girls should receive immunity during the transformation, and the villain should at least take this politeness into account. But she understood that she simply had no choice. So the girl turned to Sarasine and said that she would like to talk about the tasks that remained for that day. Don't pay attention to his scared expression. She said she would give them to Leon first, but the man should be ready as well. Clara handed her most important assistant a pile of papers to sort through, then said they needed to move on to appraising the Schulerman estate. The girl explained that she plans to conduct a preliminary investigation at that location in order to draw certain conclusions and, possibly, take some measures. As soon as the man heard about this, he immediately became upset and asked about his absence during the day. Clara, smiling nervously, said that he could leave the scene immediately after completing their investigation, but he was obliged to go with them. As soon as they arrived at the estate of Viscount Schulerman, he suddenly became very angry when he heard about the phantom thief and the note. The man, of course, thought that this would never affect him, but now that he knew that this thief was targeting him, he was furious. Clara handed him the note with a smile on her face and said that, unfortunately, it was all true, and also asked that he read the contents of this notice in order to understand what would happen next. While the man was studying the note, Clara, turning to him with a focused expression, asked if he had any items that the phantom thief might have mentioned, perhaps some auspicious works of art or a rare accessory. The Viscount immediately thought about these words, but quickly replied that in fact he had nothing of the sort at all. That the phantom thief could take on the most ordinary jewels that have no values. As soon as Clara heard about this, she immediately thought about it and said that in that case they needed to approach this issue from a different angle. The girl was silent for a while, thinking about the question, and then, turning to him, asked if he had any things, no matter the value, that a man would categorically not want to be stolen. As soon as the Viscount heard about it, he was horrified. In a trembling voice, he said that if it was something expensive that absolutely everyone owned, then perhaps he had it. Clara was immediately interested and looked at the man carefully. He replied that it could be a treasure chest in the interior of the estate, hidden very securely so that no one would see it. The girl, hearing this, was surprised and asked, "Is this really so?" The man shook his head, and at that moment she thought that the Count was probably hiding something, because his reaction was ambiguous. He began to sweat, rubbed his hands all the time, and looked away. At the night school, she was taught methods of recognizing deception and hiding information. But the girl also understood that putting pressure on him would be useless, because in this way he would only close himself off from them and would not cooperate. Clara suddenly turned her head to the other side and asked if they could inspect the house in that case, since they needed a special security plan to prevent this most terrible attack. However, the Viscount immediately rose to his feet at that moment and began to shout, saying that there was no need for this. He was not pleased that his house would be inspected for free like that, so of course he was against it. The man also said that it was a completely typical townhouse, so she could look at it from the outside. And that was it. He thought that would be enough, and there would be no need for her to wander around his house. At that moment, Clara's assistant whispered to her and said that the Count did not want to cooperate with them at all, and this irritated him. But the girl, continuing to smile, already wanted to say something but did not have time, because the butler approached the Count and said that a very important guest had arrived. Then the butler immediately whispered to his master who exactly this guest was, and the Viscount, hearing about it, was incredibly surprised. Even he did not have time to hide this surprise on his face. The man immediately smiled maliciously, turned to the butler and told him to show him as quickly as possible, because he would very much like to meet this man. Then he clapped his hands and turned to his guests already present, and said that now that they had heard that he had new visitors to entertain, he wanted them to quickly finish their investigation and leave. Clara stood up from her seat and said that she understood perfectly. In that case, they would only inspect the exterior and immediately leave his territory. But at that moment, as they were about to leave the estate, they suddenly saw who this guest was, and the girl was very surprised, because this person turned out to be Lord Rutgen, Cassin, the young Viscount. Clara simply froze in surprise and couldn't take her eyes off him, because she certainly didn't expect to see him that day, at least not in his usual role. The man, completely ignoring her presence, approached Count Schulerman and greeted him. He immediately smiled, delighted, and said that he was very pleased to welcome the young Viscount to his home. Clara stood there and didn't react at all to everything that was happening. She thought that this was exactly one of those situations when the culprit shows up at the scene of the incident early. Then suddenly, Count Schulerman asked the man for forgiveness, saying that he was really worried that the man had to come to him. However, situation was quite chaotic. However, Cassin smiled and said that he understood everything, and also that he heard that the phantom thief was targeting the man, and that was why he immediately came to him to support the Count. After that, he finally turned his attention to Clara, who was standing behind him, and said that this was probably the reason why this knight was in his estate. He smiled and said that they had met again, and that only one day had passed since then. He was very pleased about that. The girl was incredibly worried, but she did not forget about her manners, so, bowing, she said that this was indeed so, and also greeted the young Viscount. The man continued to talk to her and asked if she had finished her investigation. Then Count Schulerman intervened and said that it was true. They had just finished it and should leave. He also replied that there was absolutely nothing to explore in this estate, so he believed that this phantom thief was simply making a mistake and would waste a lot of his time. Cassin then suddenly became very serious. He turned to the knight Clara and asked, "Is this really true?" The girl knew who was standing in front of her, so she knew that she should not say anything unnecessary. So, smiling, she replied that the Count had indicated that he had no objects on his mind. The girl also added that they were going to inspect the outside of the townhouse for a security plan. The man replied that he understood that perfectly well, and also said that Chief Commander Kalovich asked that he himself, if he could do anything, definitely help in the Phantom Thief case. And it was for this reason that the man said that he would, of course, be happy to help her with this examination. Clara herself thought that he was using the technique of offering poison and antidote. However, to prevent this matter from dragging on too long, she began to walk towards the exit and said that in that case, they needed to go outside to conduct an external investigation of the estate. For a while, the man just stood there. She was already at the exit, when suddenly the Viscount finally spoke and asked if she had finished checking the interior inside. Clara stopped immediately. She already wanted to say something but didn't have time because her assistant spoke. The man said in a confident voice, like a prince, that the Count had told them that he felt awkward about inspecting the inside of his house. That was why they had planned to inspect the outside of the area only, so as not to embarrass the owner of the house.